Welcome back to Game Programming with Unity. Now in this section here, what I want to do is show you a little bit about the game objects. Now anything in the scene is a game object technically, but what I'm going to go over here right now is the type of game objects that are inherent only to Unity. So let's go ahead and look at this menu here. I'm going to create a game object, right? Now a game object is not an asset, and here's the thing that gets some people a little bit confused. If you have a game object, and I create a game object, it has not yet become an asset. It doesn't exist in your projects folder down here, right? It only exists inside the scene. So let's just create one here. So here are the different types. We have our 3D objects, and these are actual geometry, cubes, spheres, capsule, which is kind of cylindrical with rounded edges, a cylinder, a plane, and a quad, which is essentially just two triangles. And then we have a ragdoll. That's pretty advanced stuff. We're not going to worry about what a ragdoll does. And then we have a terrain, a tree, and a wind zone. And these are all environmental stuff. And we're also not going to mess around too much with the terrain creator and things like that. And 3D text. So let's go ahead and create some 3D text. Just create that. Now, let's look at our text here. Now what this does is create some text, and we can change some parameters for this text here in our inspector. I'm going to show you that in a second. But this is a good all-around object. We can just create that text and we can see how it exists. Okay, the object itself, here's our game object. It's not down here in our project yet. I'm going to show you in a little while how we can turn it into a game asset. But as it stands, it is simply an object. It exists inside the scene. So we created it in Unity. We have a few different other types here. We have our 3D object, which is any type of geometry that is created. We have a 2D object, which is a sprite. Now, once again, we're not going to do a lot of 2D stuff here, but a sprite would be something we would use in a 2D game. Now, we also have things like lights, so let's also create a point light here. And this point light has parameters of any light that any other 3D package would have. It just exists inside the game. And once again, it exists only inside of the scene, which means it's a game object right now. And some of the other things here that we're not going to spend too much time in this lesson plan is all of our UI, all of our user interface elements can be created here, and they exist under what's called a canvas. So I'm just going to create a button here, or let's say a panel. Panel's good. And what this does is creates a whole class of objects under what we call a canvas. And that canvas gets controlled by the camera that we're viewing the game from. And what I'm going to do is just go ahead and delete that. So UI elements are slightly different because they get rendered in a different space. They get rendered in camera space and screen space as opposed to world space, although it is possible to render those in world space. All right, so let's just take a look here at our game object, and I'm going to double click on it so we can zoom in. And we'll see how this game object gets read by Unity and how we can change parameters. So let's look over here, and we have things called components. All right, a component is an aspect or a parameter or attribute of a game object. And each one of these components tells this object how to behave a little bit differently. Now the first one we see here is a transform. Pretty much any object in Unity is going to have a transform in order for us to know where to see it, or in order for it to move. In order for Unity to be able to make calls to the rendering engine, it has to have a transform. Almost everything universally has a transform once it gets put into the game, except for materials, because obviously they're not transformable. All right, now a mesh renderer. If this object has geometry, 3D polygonal geometry, then it must have this component, which is a mesh renderer, which it contains all the information about converting these pixels into, converting these vertices into pixels that then get drawn to the screen. So that's what this mesh renderer does. It renders the stuff, and you can see all the rendering parameters, whether or not it receives shadows, whether or not it casts shadows, right? Which materials it has, and you can have more than one material per object, whether or not it uses light probes. Now, this light and reflection probes, those things are specific to pre-lighting and baking, which we're going to talk about a little bit later in the course. All right, now this last thing is what makes this unique is that we have what's called a text mesh, right? So here's the text, and I can just say, hello Unity, and it will change So this text, it's dynamic, right? These things exist in what's called a stack. And if you change one thing, it will update what you're seeing in the screen. And offset Z here, we're going to offset it from its regular spot. Now the thing about this text is it's only 2D text. They don't do 3D text inside the standard utilities or the standard game objects of Unity. So you can see it's basically just text that's been rendered on top of these 3D objects. But it differs from a UI in that I can move it in world space. All right, so that's just a little bit about a game object. Now, you can see down here, these are all different aspects or assets that I have pre-saved out inside of these directories. Where does this thing exist? And so a lot of people ask, well, I have a game object here. Why can't I put it into another scene? Well, you can, but you have to turn it into an asset first. In order to turn something into an asset, you have to convert it to what's called a prefab. Now, we're going to get to that a little bit in the next section, so we don't talk about it too much here, but just know that there's this distinction, a significant distinction between our asset down here, right? This is an asset because it comes from an external file. And this over here is a game object. It has not yet become an asset. So just so you understand that there is a distinction in Unity, it'll make life a lot easier when you're trying to manage multiple game objects and import assets into your scene.